She stepped off that stagecoach with one small trunk, a ruined name, and the kind of shame that sits in your chest like a stone you can't put down. The man waiting for her had never met her before. He didn't know her past, didn't know what they said about her back in Missouri, didn't know that half a dozen people had watched her world collapse and done nothing. He only knew she had answered his advertisement, and when she broke down crying in front of strangers on a dusty street at the edge of nowhere, he didn't walk away. He took off his hat, looked her in the eye, and offered her something nobody had given her in a very long time. Simple, plain respect. If you want to know what happened next, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled into Red Mesa just past noon on a Tuesday in July of 1876, and the town barely glanced up. That was the nature of frontier settlements. They had absorbed enough desperate arrivals to stop treating each one as an event. A new face meant nothing until it proved itself. The driver called out the stop, climbed down from his seat with the stiff movements of a man who had been sitting too long, and began pulling luggage from the rack without ceremony. Around him, the small cluster of buildings that made up Red Mesa baked quietly in the summer heat. A general store, a livery stable, a saloon with a warped front step, a church that had been started 3 years ago and never quite finished. Evelyn Mercer was the last passenger off the coach. She stood on the top step for a moment before climbing down, not because she was composing herself. She had given up on composing herself somewhere around the Kansas border, but because her legs had gone numb from the long ride and she needed a second to trust them again. She was 31 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome under better circumstances. Right now it was just tired. Her dress was clean but wrinkled from 3 days of travel. She carried a small trunk that she had packed and repacked twice the night before she left St. Louis, trying to decide what a woman brings when she is starting over from absolutely nothing. She had settled on 2 dresses, a winter coat, her teaching certificates, and a wooden hairbrush that had belonged to her mother. That was everything. That was all of it. She made it off the coach step and onto the street, and then she stopped. The trunk was still up on the rack, and she didn't have the energy to ask for it. The sun hit her full in the face, and the heat was different out here. Not the thick, humid heat of Missouri summers, but something drier and more aggressive, like the land itself was asking what she thought she was doing here. She didn't have a good answer. A man was standing near the post at the edge of the boardwalk. She had noticed him while the coach was still rolling in. Hard not to, because he was watching the coach with a particular kind of focus, not the idle curiosity of someone with nothing better to do, but the attention of a man who was waiting for something specific. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of weathered look that came from years of working outdoors. He wore a plain hat, plain clothes, work boots with dried mud on them. He held the hat in his hands rather than on his head, which struck her as oddly formal for a man standing in the middle of a dirt street. He was looking at her. She looked back at him and felt the exhaustion of the past several months press down on her all at once. The broken engagement, the rumors that had spread through St. Louis faster than she could deny them, the friends who had quietly stopped calling, the library board that had let her go with a polite letter full of careful language that meant they didn't want to be associated with her anymore, the long weeks staying with a distant cousin who had made it clear she couldn't stay much longer. The trip west, the 3 days on that coach watching the country get emptier and emptier until it felt like she was riding toward the edge of a map. She had answered a mail-order advertisement in a newspaper. That was how low things had gotten. She had read the small, careful notice placed by a rancher in a place called Red Mesa, widower, 200 acres, seeking a woman of good character and sound mind for marriage and partnership. And she had written back, and they had exchanged letters for 2 months, and she was here. And now she was standing in a street in Wyoming with her trunk still on the coach, and a stranger watching her, and something in her chest simply gave out. She didn't make a sound. It wasn't that kind of crying. It was the quiet kind. The kind that comes when you have held everything together for so long that your body just stops cooperating. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes filled. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stood there in the middle of the street and cried, and she couldn't make herself stop. She was vaguely aware that people were looking. Then there were footsteps, and the man from the boardwalk was standing in front of her, not close enough to crowd her, just close enough to be there. Miss Mercer, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to fill a room to be heard. I'm Cole Bennett. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It didn't help much. I'm sorry, she said. I apologize. This isn't... You had a long trip, he said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a dismissal. He said it the way you state a plain fact, like the sun being hot or the ground being dry. He put his hat back on and looked at the coach driver. That trunk hers? Yes, sir. I'll get it. He moved past her to the back of the coach and lifted the trunk down himself without waiting for the driver to do it, and then he carried it to a wagon parked on the side of the road. A solid, practical wagon pulled by two dark horses that looked well kept. He set the trunk in the back with some care, as though it contained something valuable, though she suspected he had no idea what was in it. She followed him, still pressing her fingers against her eyes, trying to get herself under control. He climbed up to the wagon seat and then looked down at her. He didn't offer his hand theatrically or make a production of it. He just looked at her with steady brown eyes and waited. I should tell you something, she said, before we go anywhere. All right. The things that were said about me in St. Louis, whatever you may have heard, or whatever reaches you later. She stopped. She had rehearsed this speech for 3 days on the coach, and now it was falling apart. I was engaged to a man named Gerald Whitmore. He came from money. He wanted a wife who would do exactly as he said and not have opinions about it. I had opinions. I ended the engagement. He was not... She took a breath. He was not gracious about it. He told people things about me that weren't true. He had enough standing in the city that people believed him. I lost my position at the library. I lost most of what I had, really. Cole Bennett looked at her for a moment. A horse somewhere in the livery stable made a sound. 2 men on the boardwalk outside the general store were watching the exchange without any particular attempt to hide it. I know, Cole said. She blinked. You... what? You told me most of that in your 3rd letter. You said you wanted me to know before I agreed to anything. He shifted on the wagon seat. I wrote back and said I still wanted to meet you. You wrote back and said you were coming. Here you are. She stared at him. He gestured at the seat beside him. Long drive back to the ranch. You want to get moving before it gets hotter? She stood there a moment longer, not because she was hesitating, but because she was trying to absorb the fact that this man, this stranger she had exchanged maybe a dozen letters with, had just made the past 3 months feel slightly less catastrophic than they had felt 10 minutes ago. He hadn't flinched, hadn't made a speech about forgiving her or giving her a chance. He had simply reminded her that they had already had this conversation and he had already made his decision. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He clicked at the horses and they started moving. The ride out to the Bennett Ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and they spent most of it in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, just the quiet of 2 people who didn't know each other well enough yet to fill every gap with words. The land opened up around them as they left Red Mesa behind, the road narrowing to a pair of tire tracks cutting through dry grass that stretched out in every direction. The sky was enormous out here, bigger than anything she had grown up with back east, and by the time the town was out of sight behind them, she was starting to understand why people described the West as both beautiful and brutal. It was both those things at once, without apology. Cole drove with a loose grip on the reins, occasionally scanning the horizon out of habit. After a while he started talking, not in the way of a man who felt obligated to entertain her, but in the practical way of someone transferring necessary information. House has 2 bedrooms, he said. I built an addition 4 years ago, so there's more room than it looks from outside. You'd have your own room, your own space. I want to be clear about that up front. Thank you, she said. I got a ranch hand named Pablo. Been with me 6 years. Good man. He'll probably be a little standoffish at first. He was the same way with everybody new. He paused. My wife passed 3 years ago. Fever. It was fast. He said it plainly, not fishing for sympathy, just filling in the relevant facts. Her name was Ruth Ann. I'm not looking to replace her. That's not what this is. I understand. What I'm looking for is a partner, someone to help run this place, and someone who wants to build something here. That's what I said in the advertisement, and it's what I mean. She looked out at the rolling grass. I can work, she said. I'm not fragile, whatever I looked like back there. That was just... She shook her head. It's been a hard few months. I'd say. I taught school for 2 years before the library. I'm good with children. I'm a fast learner with things I don't know yet. I'm not afraid of hard work. She hesitated. I am afraid of certain other things, but not hard work. Cole nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is actually listening rather than just waiting for you to stop talking. What are you afraid of? The question surprised her. People rarely asked it straight out like that. Making the same mistakes, she said finally. He considered that. Fair enough, he said, and left it there. They rode on. The ranch came into view gradually. First the windmill, then the barn, then the house itself, a solid wood frame structure that had clearly been added onto over time in a patchwork of practical improvements. It wasn't pretty. The paint on the east wall was fading. The front porch had a post that had been replaced with one that was slightly too short, leaving it visibly uneven. But it was solid, and it was real, and it sat in the middle of those endless plains like something that had decided to stay put and meant it. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up, short and broad-shouldered, maybe 50, with dark skin weathered by decades of outdoor work and a careful, assessing expression. He looked at Evelyn the way she might have expected, which was to say he looked at her like a man trying to decide something. Miss Mercer, Cole said, this is Pablo Reyes. Pablo nodded once. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Ma'am, he said, and took the horses' bridles without another word. He'll warm up, Cole said quietly as he helped her down. I'm not worried about it, she said. Inside, the house was cleaner than she had expected and more lived in than she had feared. There were books on a shelf near the window, which she noticed immediately and which made her feel irrationally a small measure of relief. A table in the kitchen that had seen serious use, scratched and solid. A stove that was clearly the center of the household. He showed her to her room, which was small but had a good window facing south, and then left her alone to settle in. She sat on the edge of the bed for a minute and looked around the room. Outside the window, the plains stretched out to a horizon so flat and far away it seemed impossible. Somewhere out there, miles back, was Red Mesa. And further back than that, 3 days east, was St. Louis and Gerald Whitmore, and a life that had been dismantled so thoroughly she barely recognized herself in the middle of it. She unpacked her trunk. The 2 dresses, the winter coat, the teaching certificates she wasn't sure anyone out here would ever want, the wooden hairbrush. She set the hairbrush on the dresser and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen to see what needed doing. The first week was a series of small adjustments and a few larger ones. She was up before Cole most mornings, which surprised him. She could tell from the way he came downstairs to find the stove already lit and coffee already made and had to reorganize whatever he had planned to say. She cooked well enough, though frontier cooking required different things than what she was used to, and she asked questions directly rather than pretending she knew how to do things she didn't. Cole answered them without condescension, which she appreciated. The ranch ran on a schedule that didn't stop for anything except severe weather, and she inserted herself into it as quickly as she could. There were chickens to manage, a kitchen garden that had been neglected since Ruth Ann's death and needed serious attention, laundry, mending, and 1,000 small tasks that kept the house functional. She did all of it, but she also started riding out with Cole in the evenings to understand the larger operation. The cattle, the pasture management, the fencing that needed constant attention along the north boundary. She fell off a horse on her 3rd day. Not dramatically, just a stumble, a moment of overcorrection, and then she was sitting in the dirt with her dignity in pieces and her left arm stinging from hitting the fence rail on her way down. Pablo was the only one who saw it. He walked over, looked down at her, and offered his hand. She took it and got up. I've only ridden a few times, she said. I know, he said. You were doing all right until you weren't. He looked at the horse, who had stopped a few feet away and was watching them with mild equine interest. You want to get back on, or you want to walk back? Get back on, she said. Pablo nodded once, and for the first time she thought she saw something shift in his expression. Not quite warmth, but something adjacent to respect. He held the horse steady while she remounted, and they rode back to the barn without another word about it. That evening at dinner, he told Cole that she had good instincts with horses. She kept her face neutral and said nothing. Red Mesa was 12 miles from the ranch, And Evelyn's first real encounter with the town proper came at the end of that first week when Cole drove in for supplies and she came along. The town was small enough that a new face was news. She felt the attention as soon as they stepped down from the wagon. Not hostile exactly, but weighing. The kind of attention that a place gives someone it hasn't made up its mind about yet. Cole seemed either unaware of it or practiced at ignoring it. He moved through the general store with comfortable ease, talking to the owner, a heavyset man named Harlan Briggs, about an order that had come in late. Evelyn stayed close and watched and tried to read the room. There were two women near the dry goods shelves. They acknowledged her with the careful politeness of people who were reserving judgment. She returned it in kind. A man she didn't know tipped his hat to Cole and glanced at her with undisguised curiosity. "The new Bennett woman," she heard someone murmur. She had been called worse. She kept moving. The real moment came outside when they were loading the wagon. A man crossed the street toward them with the deliberate ease of someone who had decided to make an approach and was taking his time about it. He was well dressed for a frontier town. Good boots, a hat that cost more than most people around here spent on a month of food. He had the kind of broad, handsome face that probably worked in his favor in most situations, and he seemed to know it. "Cole," he said, nodding at Bennett. Then his eyes moved to Evelyn. "And this must be the new arrangement." Cole's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Evelyn Mercer," he said. "Miss Mercer, Wade Crowley. He runs the Double C north of here." "Miss Mercer." Crowley touched the brim of his hat. He was smiling, but it was the smile of a man performing civility rather than feeling it. "Quite a journey from St. Louis, I imagine." "It was," she said evenly. "I hope Red Mesa meets your expectations." There was something in the way he said it, a faint emphasis on expectations, that told her exactly what kind of man Wade Crowley was. She had met his type before. Gerald Whitmore had been his type, just with a city polish instead of a frontier one. "I don't have fixed expectations," she said. "I find it's better to form opinions from experience." Crowley's smile stayed in place, but something behind it went a little flat. "Wise," he said. He looked back at Cole. "We should talk about the water rights on the north fence when you have a moment." "Come by the ranch," Cole said. His voice hadn't changed, but Evelyn noticed he had moved, subtly, slightly forward, positioning himself differently than he'd been standing before. "I'll be there." Crowley nodded, touched his hat at Evelyn again, in a way that somehow managed to be dismissive without being obviously rude, and walked back across the street. Cole watched him go for a moment, then turned to the wagon. "He's trouble," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. "He has been," Cole said. He picked up a sack of flour without elaborating. She filed the name away. Wade Crowley. She had been in Red Mesa less than 2 hours, and she already had a sense of the shape of what was coming.
I'm not.
The second week brought the first real storm. It came in fast the way summer storms did out here. A darkness building on the western horizon that went from notable to threatening in under an hour. Cole saw it coming and started moving with a focused urgency that told Evelyn it was serious. He and Pablo got the cattle into the lower pasture and secured the barn while she battened down the house, shutters, doors, anything loose that could become a projectile in high wind. The storm hit in the early evening and was worse than she had prepared for. The wind didn't build gradually. It arrived at full force, driving rain sideways against the windows, and the noise of it made the house feel small and temporary. She had grown up with Missouri thunderstorms, which could be dramatic, but this was something different. This felt more personal, as though the weather out here wasn't random but directed. Cole and Pablo came in soaked, and she had hot coffee waiting and dry towels and a stew she had kept going on the stove. And afterward, the three of them sat at the kitchen table and listened to the wind work against the house and didn't talk much but didn't need to. Somewhere around midnight, after Pablo had gone to his quarters in the barn, Cole and Evelyn were still at the table. The storm was still going outside, but it had settled into a steadier rhythm. The lamp between them threw orange light against the walls. "Does it always come that fast?" she asked. "Usually faster," Cole said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "You handled it well today." "I just did what needed doing." "That's what handling it well looks like." He looked at the table. Ruth Ann hated storms. She'd go quiet for days after a bad one. He said it simply, without grief performing itself, just a fact about a person who had been real. She sounds like she was someone, Evelyn said. She was. He looked up at her briefly, then back down. This is strange, he said. Sitting here with someone. It's been 3 years of quiet evenings. I can imagine. Not complaining, he added quickly. Just, it's different. Different isn't bad, she said. He looked at her again, and this time held the look for a moment. No, he agreed. It's not. Outside, the storm pushed against the house, and the lamp flame bent slightly in a draft from somewhere under the door, and neither of them said anything else for a while. It wasn't the silence of two strangers avoiding each other. It was something quieter than that, and more interesting. She had been at the ranch 3 weeks when she heard the first real version of the rumor. She was in town picking up mail. Cole had trusted her to go alone, which she had taken note of, when she overheard 2 women talking outside the milliner's shop. They lowered their voices when they saw her, which told her everything, but she had already caught enough. Says she was run out of St. Louis for, Crowley told Henry, and Henry told, don't know what Cole was thinking. She kept walking. She collected the mail. She smiled at Harlan Briggs behind the counter of the general store and bought the items on Cole's list without indicating that anything was wrong. On the ride back to the ranch, she let herself feel it, the familiar weight of it, the particular exhaustion of knowing that someone was working against you and that the work had already started without you. She recognized the shape of the campaign. She had watched Gerald Whitmore run it back in St. Louis with practiced efficiency. First, you let the rumors find their own feet. Then you offer a little helpful detail to the right people. Then you wait for the subject of the rumors to either collapse or overreact, and either outcome serves your purpose. She had collapsed in St. Louis. She had given Whitmore exactly what he wanted by disappearing, by retreating, by letting the narrative go unopposed. She was not going to make the same mistake twice. She told Cole that evening, straight and without dramatizing it. Crowley is running something, she said. I don't know how much of it has to do with the water rights and how much of it is just him wanting to cause trouble, but he's talking to people. Cole sat with that for a moment. He didn't look surprised. What did you hear? Enough to know it started, not enough to know how bad it is yet. He nodded. He's been trying to push me out for 2 years, he said. The water rights are real. There's a dispute over a creek on the north boundary, but this isn't just about water. He wants the land, and he wants me gone, and making trouble for you is probably the easiest handle he's found. Why is it easier to go after me than you? Cole looked at her directly. Because you're new. Because you came from somewhere else. Because there are things about your past that he can use to paint a picture. He paused. And because he figures a woman alone won't fight back. She looked out the window at the darkening plains. He's wrong about that last part, she said. Cole almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to it on his face. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm starting to think so. She started the reading lessons the following week. It began simply. She noticed that 2 of the children she had spoken to at the general store couldn't read the label on a seed packet. She asked their mother if she could work with them twice a week. The mother said yes with a cautious gratitude that suggested she had expected to be told no. By the 3rd session, there were 4 children. By the 5th, there were 7, and one of their older siblings had started hanging around at the edge of the lessons, trying to look like he wasn't interested. She held the sessions in the back room of the general store, which Harlan Briggs offered when he understood what she was doing. It was crowded and the light wasn't great, and some of the children squirmed like they were sitting on hot coals. But they were learning. She could see it happening. The moment when a word clicked into recognition, the expression on a child's face when something that had been opaque suddenly became readable. She had always loved that moment. It was the best thing about teaching. It was also, she realized, slowly changing the way people in Red Mesa looked at her. Not dramatically. This wasn't a story where one act of generosity erased everything. But she would catch it sometimes. A mother watching her with the children and then nodding to herself, or Harlan pausing to listen from the doorway before going back to his counter. Small things. Real things. Wade Crowley's rumors hadn't stopped. She knew that. She could feel them working in the background, in the way certain people looked at her, and in the careful distance some of the older families still kept. But she wasn't running. She was here, she was working, she was teaching their children to read. And she was starting to understand that in a place like Red Mesa, where people had to build things with their hands every single day, what you did with your time meant more than what someone said about you in a rumor. She was going to make them see her, not the version of her that Whitmore or Crowley described, the real version, the one who got back on the horse after she fell, the one who had coffee ready during the storm, the one who showed up every week in that back room and worked with their children until the word stopped being a mystery. She was going to make them see all of it, whether they wanted to or not. That was not arrogance. That was not overconfidence. That was a woman who had already lost everything once and had decided quietly and completely that she was done running. The summer pressed on around her. The work didn't stop. The land didn't care about rumors. The children kept coming to their lessons. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, Evelyn Mercer stopped feeling like a woman in exile and started feeling like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be, even with everything that was still coming. Even with Crowley's campaign still building in the background and the whole town still watching to see what she was made of. She had made up her mind, and her mind did not unmake easily. That, perhaps, was the one thing Gerald Whitmore had never understood about her. It was the thing Wade Crowley was about to find out. The thing about rumors in a small town is that they don't arrive all at once. They come in pieces. A hesitation here, a conversation that stops when you walk into a room, a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes of someone who was perfectly warm to you the week before. Evelyn had learned to read these signs back in St. Louis, where the social machinery was more sophisticated, but the damage was the same. Out here, the machinery was cruder, but it moved faster, because there were fewer people and less noise to slow it down. By the end of her 4th week in Red Mesa, she could feel Crowley's work settling into the town like sediment. It showed up in small ways first. Martha Briggs, Harlan's wife, who had been reserved but not unfriendly during Evelyn's first visits to the store, started finding reasons to be in the back room when Evelyn came in. A woman named Frances Aldred, whose 2 boys came to the reading lessons, began sending them with a neighbor instead of bringing them herself. At the Sunday gathering outside the unfinished church, not a service, just the weekly habit the town had of collecting itself in one place, 2 of the ranching families positioned themselves at the far end of the yard and kept their distance with the deliberate casualness of people who had decided something. Evelyn noticed all of it. She didn't mention it to Cole right away, not because she was trying to protect him from it, but because she was still taking inventory, still trying to understand exactly how far the damage had spread before she said anything out loud. Cole noticed it too, though. He came in from the north pasture one evening in the 3rd week of August, looking like a man who had been turning something over in his mind for most of the day. He washed up at the basin outside, came in, sat at the table, and watched her set dinner out for a moment before he said anything. "Henry Aldred stopped me on the road today," he said. She set the pan down on the iron rest and looked at him. "What did he say?" "He was careful about it, said he heard some things, wanted to give me the chance to explain." Cole's jaw moved. "Like I owed him an explanation about who lives on my land." "What did you tell him?" "I told him what I know about you, which is that you work harder than most men I've hired, and you've taught his boys more in 5 sessions than they learned in a year of occasional schooling." He looked down at his hands. He wasn't satisfied, but he didn't push it further. Evelyn sat down across from him. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," she said. "I know that. Crowley isn't done. Whatever he's told people so far is probably just the setup. He'll add to it. He'll pick the right moments." She said it evenly, without heat, because she had thought through most of this already, and the emotion had burned off and left something cleaner behind. "In St. Louis, I waited. I thought it would die down on its own. I thought people would figure out the truth eventually if I just kept my head down." She paused. "That was a mistake. The longer I waited, the more ground I gave up." Cole was watching her with that focused attention she had come to recognize. Not staring, just present, actually listening. "I'm not going to do that again," she said. "What are you going to do instead?" She thought about it for a moment. "I'm going to be so plainly myself, so consistently and visibly myself, that the rumor and the reality can't occupy the same space anymore. People will have to choose between what Crowley says and what they see with their own eyes." She looked at him. "That's a slower strategy. It doesn't feel satisfying, but it's the one that holds." Cole nodded once, then he picked up his fork. That's about the most sensible thing I've heard anyone say in a long time, he said, and started eating. She almost laughed. She didn't, quite, but it was closer than she'd come in months. August turned serious in the way that late summer on the frontier could, not cooling off, but intensifying. The heat drier and more relentless, the grass going brown and brittle, the creek on the south side of the property dropping to a thin thread of itself. The cattle needed moving to better grass, and the water situation on the north boundary, which had been a slow-burning dispute for months, started demanding real attention. The creek in question ran along the fence line between the Bennett Ranch and Crowley's Double C. For most of the year, it was narrow but reliable, fed by snowmelt from the mountains to the west. In a dry summer like this one, reliability was not a word that applied. The creek was pulling back toward the Double C side, which meant the water access Cole's cattle depended on in the north pasture was shrinking, and Crowley's fences had been creeping south over the past 2 years, in increments small enough to argue about, but large enough to matter. Cole explained this one evening while they were checking the north fence line together. He had started taking her along on these rides regularly now, partly because an extra set of eyes was genuinely useful, and partly, she thought, because they had both discovered that they talked more easily on horseback than they did sitting still. "He's not taking the water directly," Cole said, riding alongside a stretch of fence that leaned at a wrong angle. "That would be too obvious. He's just nudging, moving the line a little here, a little there, changing what counts as his side." "Has he done this to other ranchers?" Evelyn asked. "2 others that I know of. One sold and left. The other one is still fighting it, but he's tired." Cole stopped his horse and looked at the fence line. "The law out here is theoretical. Sheriff Macon is a decent man, but he's one person, and the county is enormous. Crowley knows how far he can push before anything official happens. So he just keeps pushing." "That's been the strategy, yeah." Evelyn looked at the fence, then at the creek beyond it, now barely 6 feet wide where it had been 12 in the spring. "Has he ever tried to buy you out directly?" "Twice. Once 3 years ago. Once last spring. Both times I said no." "What did he say when you said no?" Cole's mouth went thin. "Last spring he said, and I'm giving you the cleaned up version, that I was being sentimental about a piece of dirt, and that eventually I'd come to my senses." He paused. "That was about 2 weeks before he started talking to people in town about my mail order situation. The pieces settled into place cleanly. He thinks that undermining me undermines you," Evelyn said. "If the town thinks you brought scandal onto your ranch, your standing goes down. Your standing goes down. Your leverage in any dispute goes down." "That's about right. He's not doing this because of me. He's doing this to get to you through me." "Partly." Cole looked at her. "But I also think he's the kind of man who enjoys it regardless. Making someone feel small. It's a habit with him." She thought about Gerald Whitmore, the particular pleasure he had taken in the systematic dismantling of her reputation, not just as a means to an end, but as something he had relished in itself. Some men were built that way. They found power in reduction, in making the world smaller and meaner around anyone who refused to comply. "I know that type," she said quietly. Cole looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I imagine you do." They rode the fence line for another hour without much talk, just the sound of the horses and the hot wind moving through the dry grass, and somewhere in that hour Evelyn felt something settle between them. Not romance, not yet, nothing that simple or that fast, but something real. The particular ease of 2 people who have started to understand each other without having to explain themselves at every turn. The reading lessons continued through August, and they were, quietly, the thing that kept Evelyn most grounded. The group had grown to 9 children by now, ranging from a 6-year-old named Clara, who approached every lesson with terrifying seriousness, to a 12-year-old boy named Robbie Marsh, whose older brother had stopped pretending he wasn't interested and now sat against the wall in the back of the room claiming he was just there to walk Robbie home. His name was Danny. He was 14. He couldn't read his own name. She had started working with him separately, casually, without drawing attention to it, and the progress he was making was something she kept to herself, like something fragile. Parents came and went, dropping children off, picking them up. Most of them were civil. A few were warm. A handful still carried that careful distance that told her Crowley's stories hadn't finished circulating. One afternoon, a woman named Dorothea Crane came to collect her daughter and stayed in the doorway longer than necessary, watching the lesson. Dorothea was one of the oldest established families in Red Mesa. Her husband ran the town's only smithy and had lived there since before the town had a name. Her opinion carried weight in a way that most people's didn't. After the other children had gone, Dorothea looked at Evelyn with the direct, unornamented manner of a woman who had survived too much to bother with softness she didn't mean. "My Alice has been spelling her own name every night before supper," she said. "Shows her father. He makes her do it again so he can watch." Evelyn smiled. "She picks things up fast." "She does." Dorothea paused. "I've heard things about you." "I'm sure you have. I'm not going to tell you what. I imagine you know well enough." "I imagine I do," Evelyn said. Dorothea looked at her steadily. She wasn't a warm woman, and she wasn't performing warmth now. She was just being straight. "My husband says a person's character shows in how they work. He's been saying it for 30 years, and he's usually right." She picked up Alice's reader from the table and handed it to her daughter. "I'll see you Thursday, Miss Mercer." It was not a declaration of support. It was not an erasure of suspicion. It was something more honest than either of those things. A woman deciding to keep watching, keep assessing, and leave the verdict open. In a town that had already started picking sides, that kind of careful fairness felt like more than it sounded. "Thursday," Evelyn said. The confrontation she had known was coming arrived on a Friday afternoon in late August. She was at the general store when she heard Crowley's voice before she saw him. That particular carrying tone that men who were used to being listened to developed, projecting without effort. He was at the counter talking to Harlan, and he had an audience. 2 ranchers she recognized from the Sunday gatherings, and a woman named Patricia Sims whose husband worked at the feed mill. Evelyn came around the end of the shelving unit, and Crowley saw her and didn't stop talking. That was deliberate. She understood that immediately. He had probably seen her come in. "The thing about women coming west without anyone to account for them," he was saying, with the conversational ease of a man finishing a point he'd been making for a while. "No family, no real references, just stories about themselves. It puts a man in a difficult position. Cole's a decent man and he was lonely, and that's understandable. But decent men can be taken advantage of by someone who knows how to present herself." The store went quiet, in the specific way of a room where everyone is suddenly paying close attention while trying to look like they're not. Evelyn set her basket on the counter. Crowley looked at her with something that had the surface texture of surprise and the actual quality of satisfaction. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I didn't see you there." "Yes, you did," she said. A beat of silence. "I beg your pardon?" "You saw me come in. You kept talking anyway." She said it without particular heat, the way you state something obvious. She looked at Harlan, whose expression had gone careful and watchful, and then at Patricia Sims, who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mr. Crowley has been saying things about me to people in this town for several weeks now. I'd rather address it directly than pretend I don't know it's happening." Crowley's easy manner developed a slight edge. "I've only shared what I know." "What you know," she said, "is what Gerald Whitmore of St. Louis told anyone who would listen after I refused to marry him. I'd like to explain to anyone who's interested what actually happened, because Mr. Whitmore's version and the truth are not the same thing." She looked at the room. Not confrontationally, not performing strength she didn't feel, just directly, the way a woman looks at people she is trying to reach. "I was a librarian. I was engaged to a man from a prominent family. He wanted a wife who would be quiet and decorative and not have inconvenient opinions. I had inconvenient opinions. I ended the engagement. He was humiliated, and he had the money and the connections to make sure I paid for it, and he used both." She paused. "That's the whole story. There's nothing else." Crowley smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. "A version of events," he said, "from the person most interested in how they're received." "That's fair," Evelyn said. "You should weigh it accordingly, but you should also weigh the fact that Mr. Crowley is in a land dispute with Cole Bennett, and that making trouble for me makes trouble for Cole." She looked at Patricia Sims, then at the 2 ranchers. "I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to think about whose interests are served by the things you're hearing." The room was very quiet. Crowley's smile had gone completely now. He was looking at her with something that was no longer performing civility, something more direct and less pleasant. "You've got nerve," he said. "I'll give you that." "I've had to develop it," she said. She looked at Harlan. "I need flour, salt, and whatever came in on the supply order for the Bennett place." She kept her voice even. "Whenever you're ready." Harlan moved to get her order with the slightly dazed efficiency of a man operating on habit, because the room required something normal to happen. Crowley said nothing further. The two ranchers exchanged a glance that she couldn't interpret. Patricia Sims was still looking at her with that unreadable expression. Evelyn stayed at the counter and waited for her order, her hands flat on the wood surface, her breathing steady. Inside, her heart was going harder than she would have preferred, but that was between her and herself. She had not retreated. She had not collapsed. She had stood in that room and said the true thing out loud in front of witnesses, and whatever happened next, that could not be taken back. Cole was at the barn when she got home, repairing a section of gate that had been giving trouble. He looked up when she came in with the wagon, read something in her face, and set down his tools. She told him what had happened while she unhitched the horses. All of it, straight through. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes." "You sure?" She looked at him. "I'm not fragile, Cole." "I know you're not. I asked if you were all right, not if you were fragile. Those are different questions." She considered that for a moment. Her hands were still moving through the familiar motions of unloading the wagon without her having to think about it. "I'm better than I expected to be," she said finally. Saying it out loud in a room full of people was harder than I planned for, but I'm glad I did it. Cole nodded. He picked up one of the flour sacks and carried it toward the house, and she followed with another. "Crowley's going to be angry," he said. "He already was." "Angrier then?" "Probably." They set the supplies down in the kitchen. Cole stood at the table for a moment, and she could see him working through something, not second-guessing her, something else. "I should have been there," he said. "You didn't know I'd need you to be." "Still?" He looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who is used to handling problems directly and doesn't like learning that a problem happened while his back was turned. "Next time something's building up like that, tell me sooner. Not because you can't handle it, because—" He stopped, looked for the right words, didn't entirely find them. "Because you shouldn't have to handle everything alone." The kitchen was warm from the afternoon heat still sitting in the walls. Outside, Pablo was talking to the horses in the low, even way he had, the words carrying faintly through the window without being intelligible. "All right," she said quietly. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nobody would have written a song about it, but it was real, and she filed it away in the place where she kept things that mattered. The wooden hairbrush on the dresser, Danny Marsh learning to read his own name, Pablo's hand reaching down to help her up from the dirt. Cole Bennett saying you shouldn't have to handle everything alone. It was August in Wyoming, and the land outside was dry and hard, and Crowley wasn't done, and the town was still watching, and none of that had changed. But something had. The days after the confrontation at Briggs' store were strange and suspended, like the air before a storm that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to break. Evelyn went about her work and waited. She had learned enough about how these things moved to know that what she had said in that store would take time to settle. Time for people to turn it over, compare it against what Crowley had told them, weigh one version against the other. There was nothing she could do to speed that process. She could only keep showing up and let the weight of consistent reality do what speeches couldn't. Cole didn't hover. That was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He had a particular quality of steadiness that didn't require constant expression. He knew what she had done, and he respected it. And he didn't make a production of either. He just kept working beside her, and the ranch kept moving, and life out on those plains had a useful way of filling every available hour with something that needed doing regardless of what the town thought about anything. But Crowley was not finished. She had known he wouldn't be. The next move came not from Crowley directly, but from the edges of his influence, which was how he preferred to operate, keeping his own hands visible and clean while the damage spread outward from him. A man named Silas Peck, who ran a small horse operation south of town and owed Crowley a significant debt on a loan that had never quite been paid off, started talking at the saloon. Evelyn didn't hear this firsthand. She heard it from Pablo, who had gone into town for a part for the water pump and come back with the information delivered in his characteristically sparse manner. "Peck's been saying you ran a boarding house in St. Louis," Pablo told her, not looking up from the pump mechanism he was examining. "The kind that isn't really a boarding house." Evelyn set down the bucket she was carrying. "Is that right?" "That's what I heard." She stood there for a moment. The specific ugliness of it landed the way these things always did. Not with shock, because she had expected escalation, but with a particular tiredness that went deeper than physical. There was a special kind of exhaustion in being made into something you weren't, over and over, by people who had decided the story they needed was more important than the truth. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Pablo finally looked at her. His face was its usual careful neutral, but there was something underneath it. Not pity, which she would have hated, but the look of a man who had his own long history with being reduced by other people's stories and recognized the shape of it. "Cole, no? I'll tell him tonight." Pablo nodded and went back to the pump. She picked up her bucket and kept moving because that was all you could do. "Itam." Cole's reaction when she told him was quieter and more dangerous than anger. He sat at the kitchen table and listened, and his face went very still in a way she hadn't seen before. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "Peck doesn't come up with something like that on his own," he said. "No. Crowley's running out of patience." He looked at the table. "He expected you to leave by now. You didn't. He expected the town to freeze you out. It hasn't. Not completely. So he's pushing harder." "I know. This is going to keep escalating until something forces it to stop." He looked at her. "The harvest gathering is in 3 weeks. The whole county comes. It's the one time all year when every family from every ranch is in the same place at the same time." She understood what he was thinking before he said it. "A public moment," she said. "The biggest one we get. If Crowley is going to make a final move, that's where he'll make it. And if you're going to—" He stopped. "I'm not telling you what to do. I want to be clear about that. But if you're thinking about making a stand, that's the ground where it matters most." She thought about it. 3 weeks. The whole county in one place, watching. Everything she had been building. The quiet daily work, the lessons, the small accumulations of trust, either meaning something by then or not. "I'm not going to let him pick the moment," she said. "If it comes to it at the gathering, I'm going to pick it myself." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "You're not going to argue with me about it?" "Why would I argue with you about it?" She didn't have a quick answer for that. She had spent so long around men who argued with her about everything, her tone, her approach, her right to have an approach at all, that the absence of it still occasionally caught her off guard. "Some men would," she said. "I'm not some men," Cole said. It wasn't arrogant. It was just plain. He stood up from the table. "I'll be there, right beside you, whatever happens." She nodded. She didn't say thank you because it didn't feel like the right word for what he'd just offered. She just nodded, and he went out to finish the evening chores, and she stood in the kitchen for a minute in the quiet and let the steadiness of him settle into her like something she hadn't known she needed. The 3 weeks between that conversation and the harvest gathering were some of the most concentrated of Evelyn's life. She taught her lessons. She worked the ranch. She rode the fence lines with Cole and helped manage the water dispute on the north boundary, where Crowley's encroachment had been temporarily checked by a letter Cole had sent to the county surveyor requesting an official measurement, a procedural move that wouldn't resolve anything permanently, but bought time and put something on the record. She helped Pablo with a difficult birth in the cattle, standing in a cold pre-dawn barn for 2 hours holding a lantern while he worked with quiet, focused expertise, and coming out the other side with a calf that survived, and a deeper understanding of why Pablo was worth 6 ordinary ranch hands. She also, during those 3 weeks, had a conversation with Dorothea Crane that she would think about for a long time afterward. It happened on a Thursday after the reading lesson. Alice had gone home ahead of her mother, and Dorothea had stayed behind, which was unusual. She sat down across from Evelyn at the small table without preamble and folded her hands. "I've been asking around," Dorothea said. "About you, about St. Louis, about this Whitmore person." Evelyn kept her expression neutral. "And? My husband has a cousin in Kansas City who has business contacts in St. Louis. He asked some questions." Dorothea paused. "Gerald Whitmore is a well-known name. His family has money and standing.
He's also been engaged twice since you, and both of those women left him as well. She looked at Evelyn steadily. One of them told my husband's cousin that Whitmore had a habit of managing people, controlling what they were allowed to say and to whom. She left because he read her private correspondence.
Evelyn said nothing. I'm not telling you this to make you feel better about the past, Dorothea said. I'm telling you because I think you should know that there are people in this town who are capable of thinking for themselves and who have been doing so. She stood up. My husband thinks Crowley is the same kind of man as Whitmore. Different setting, same instrument. Your husband is perceptive, Evelyn said. He has his moments. Dorothea picked up her coat from the back of the chair. The harvest gathering, my husband and I will be there. We see what we see. She looked at Evelyn one more time with that direct, assessing gaze. Don't let them make you small. You're not a small woman. She left. Evelyn sat at the table for a moment after the door closed and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a rescue. It was one woman telling another woman, I looked and I saw you clearly, and you are not what they say. In the context of everything that had been happening, it was enormous. The harvest gathering was held on the first Saturday of September, at the wide, flat ground east of town that served as a fairground whenever the county needed one. By 9 in the morning, the wagons were already lined up along the eastern fence, families spreading blankets and setting up tables, the smell of wood smoke and cooked food mixing with the dry grass smell of late summer. It was the kind of occasion that the frontier produced periodically to remind itself that it was more than just isolated people grinding through isolated work. A collective exhale, a day for the whole scattered community to exist in the same space. Evelyn had been awake since before dawn. Not from nerves, or not entirely. She had slept the night before with the particular flat-out unconsciousness of someone whose body had overridden their mind and demanded rest regardless of circumstances. But she was up early and dressed carefully, not because she wanted to perform anything, but because she understood that today was a day when appearances were part of the substance. She wore her better dress. She put her hair up properly. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser for a moment, not with satisfaction, just with assessment. The way you check your equipment before a difficult job. The wooden hairbrush caught her eye. She picked it up and used it and set it back down, and went downstairs. Cole was already at the table. Pablo had decided not to come. He never came to the gathering, which was his right, and he had offered to stay and keep an eye on the property, which was useful. Cole looked up when she came down, and something moved across his face that wasn't quite a word yet. You look ready, he said. I am, she said. They drove to town mostly in silence, which was their way. Not a troubled silence, but a working one. Two people using the time to think rather than filling it with talk that didn't need to happen. The sun was sharp, and the sky was the particular high blue of early September in Wyoming, the kind of sky that seemed further away than it had any right to be. When they arrived, Evelyn felt the shift in the gathering's atmosphere almost immediately. Not hostility, nothing that simple. More like the charged quality of a crowd that is watching something it knows is approaching. The way people at a card game go quieter when the hand gets serious. People had heard about the confrontation at Briggs's store. Of course they had. In a town this size, something like that was fully distributed within 24 hours. Some of them looked at her with something that might have been respect and might have been curiosity, and was probably both. Others kept their distance with the careful positioning she recognized by now. A few went out of their way to greet her, which meant more than it might have under ordinary circumstances. She saw the Cranes. Dorothea gave her a brief nod that conveyed everything it needed to. Her husband, a large, quiet man named George, shook Evelyn's hand with straightforward firmness and asked how the lessons were going. She told him. He listened. It was a simple exchange, and it was also, in the context of that day, a kind of public statement. She saw Patricia Sims, who had been at the store during the confrontation. Patricia caught her eye across the gathering and held it for a moment, then nodded once. Small, private, but there. She did not see Crowley until nearly noon. He came in from the north side of the fairground with 3 men she didn't recognize, double C hands by the look of them, and Silas Peck trailing slightly behind with the hangdog posture of a man who had been useful and was no longer sure he wanted to be. Crowley moved through the gathering with his usual ease, stopping to talk, pressing flesh. performing the social comfort of a man who had spent years cultivating standing in this community and knew how to use a public occasion. He saw her. She saw him see her. Neither of them looked away immediately. Then he turned back to his conversation, and she turned back to hers. Cole, standing beside her, said nothing. His hand was not on her arm. He wasn't positioning himself protectively. He was just standing next to her, present, easy, a fact of the landscape. The afternoon moved. There was food, there were children running, there was the ordinary noise and warmth of a community feeding itself and talking and existing together. Evelyn moved through it and spoke to people and watched and waited, because she knew something was coming and she had decided she was going to meet it on her own terms. It came in the mid-afternoon during the loosest part of the gathering when people had eaten and the formality had gone out of the day and the conversations were getting more honest. Crowley had gathered a loose circle around him near the center of the ground. Not a crowd, just the natural collection of people that forms around someone who is talking with confidence. She caught fragments. Shouldn't have to wonder about who's in their community. A man's reputation in this county is only as good as the company he keeps. She walked toward it. Cole said quietly, "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "Come if you want to." She heard him fall into step behind her. She walked into the edge of that loose circle and stopped. Crowley saw her and paused mid-sentence. The people around him turned. She recognized several of them. Henry Aldred, the Marsh family, 2 men from the other side of the county she'd seen at the Sunday gatherings. Maybe 15 people in total, and beyond them the general drift of the gathering, which was beginning to notice. "Mr. Crowley," she said. Her voice was level and clear. "I think we should finish this conversation." Crowley smiled. He was good at that smile. Warm and assured on the surface, nothing underneath it. "Miss Mercer, I was just talking with some neighbors." "I know what you were talking about." She looked at the people around her, not confrontationally, but directly. The way she looked at her students when she wanted them to actually hear something. "I know what's been said about me in this town for the past 2 months. I know where it started, and I know why. So let me say something plainly to everyone here, and then we can all make up our minds." Nobody moved. The gathering had gone quiet around them in the way that gatherings do when something real is happening. "My name is Evelyn Mercer. I came from St. Louis because my life there was destroyed by a man who couldn't accept being refused. I came west because I had nothing left back east, and I answered an advertisement placed by an honest man who needed a partner. And Cole Bennett is exactly the man he represented himself to be in those letters." She paused. "I have been working on that ranch for 2 months. I have been teaching your children to read in my spare time. I have not lied to anyone. I have not caused any harm to this community, and I am not what Wade Crowley has been telling you I am." She looked at Crowley directly. "You are in a land dispute with Cole. That dispute is about money and about property and about the fact that Cole won't sell what's his. This," she indicated the gathered people with a slight gesture, "is not about my character. It is about that dispute. I am the lever you found that you thought would be easiest to use." Crowley's smile was gone. In its place was the expression she had been waiting to see. Not rage, he was too controlled for that, but the look of a man whose machinery has been exposed to open air and is operating in front of people who can see all the working parts. "That's a serious accusation," he said. His voice was still even, but there was something grinding underneath it. "It's a plain one," she said. "If I'm wrong, tell me what I'm wrong about." Silence. Henry Aldred was looking at Crowley with an expression that had shifted from neutral to something more considered. One of the men she didn't know had crossed his arms. Then Cole spoke from just behind her and to her left. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform anything. He just said it quietly and let it carry on its own weight. "I've known Wade Crowley for 12 years, he said. "He's tried to buy my land twice. He's moved his fence line 3 times. And for the past 2 months, he has been working to push Evelyn out of this community before she had a chance to become part of it." He paused. "That's what I know. You all can make of it what you want." The silence that followed was the loudest kind, the kind that means a room has shifted and is working out what it has just become. Crowley looked around at the faces watching him. He had run this kind of operation before, and he knew when a room had turned. Something in his posture changed, not collapse. He was not a man who collapsed easily, but a controlled reassessment. "Cole and I have a property dispute," he said finally, to the group at large. "That's between us and the county surveyor. I don't see what bit. He stopped. He had run out of road, and he knew it. Neither do I, said George Crane from somewhere at the edge of the circle, in the mild tone of a man who has waited long enough to say something and has chosen his moment carefully. The gathering exhaled. Not dramatically. Nothing broke. Nobody cheered. There was no grand resolution. But the air changed. The circle began to lose its shape as people drifted away in ones and twos back to their food and their families, taking what they had just seen with them and doing what people do, turning it over, deciding what they thought, filing it into the story they were building about who was who in this community. Crowley left shortly after. He did it without hurry, without slamming anything, maintaining the dignity of a man who has not technically been defeated, even if he knows something has changed. She watched him go. Her heart was still going too fast. Her hands, she noticed when she looked down at them, had been clenched at her sides. She opened them deliberately. Cole appeared beside her. He didn't say anything, he just stood there, and after a moment she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Not all at once, but gradually, the way Cole does when you finally come in from outside. "You all right?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked after the store. She had given him the same answer then. She gave him a different one now. "Not entirely," she said, "but I will be." He nodded. Someone called his name from across the gathering, and he excused himself and went. Evelyn stood where she was for a moment longer, looking out at the fairground. The families, the children, the smoke and noise and ordinary life of a community that had just watched something and was now deciding what it meant. She had done what she came to do. She had said the true thing in the loudest room available, and she had not flinched from it, and Cole had been there, not in front of her but beside her. And the difference between those two positions was everything. It was not over. She knew that. The land dispute was not resolved, Crowley was not finished, and trust was something that had to be demonstrated over time rather than declared in a single afternoon. But something had ended today, and something else had started. And standing in the September light on the Wyoming plains with the noise of her community around her, Evelyn Mercer felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground under her feet was solid. Not because anyone had given it to her, because she had stood on it and refused to move. The weeks after the harvest gathering moved differently than the weeks before it. Not easier, exactly. The work didn't lighten and the land didn't get any more forgiving as September pushed toward October and the first cold came down from the mountains in the mornings. But the quality of the difficulty changed. Before the gathering, Evelyn had been fighting on two fronts at once, the physical demands of the ranch and the social erosion that Crowley had been engineering beneath the surface. After the gathering, the second front went quieter. Not silent, just quieter. And that made everything else more manageable. She noticed it first in the small transactions of daily life. Harlan Briggs started talking to her at the counter the way he talked to everyone else. The ordinary, unremarkable conversation of a shopkeeper who has decided a customer is simply a customer. His wife Martha reappeared in the front of the store. Frances Aldred brought her boys to the reading lesson herself again and stayed long enough to watch for a few minutes before she left, which she hadn't done in weeks. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet reversal of quiet withdrawals, and Evelyn recognized them for what they were. The town adjusting its position without announcing that it was doing so. There was no moment of formal vindication. No one came to her and said, "We were wrong, we should have known better." That was not how these things worked, and she hadn't expected it. What happened instead was more gradual and more real. People simply began treating her as someone who belonged there, and the absence of the old watchfulness was its own statement. Cole noticed it too, though he said less about it than she did. "Henry Aldred asked me yesterday how the lessons were going," he told her one evening over dinner. Said his boys talked about nothing else at the supper table. "That's because Robbie Marsh told them I let him read a chapter out loud last week," Evelyn said. "Now they all want to turn." Cole almost smiled. "You're good at this." "I've always been good at this. It's the other things I've had to figure out." He looked at her across the table. "What other things?" She thought about it honestly. Letting things take the time they take. I've spent most of my life trying to resolve things faster than they wanted to be resolved. She pushed her food around her plate. "St. Louis. I kept thinking if I just explained myself clearly enough, often enough, the right people would hear it and the situation would change. But the situation wasn't about the truth. It was about power. No amount of explaining was going to fix that. What changed out here? I stopped explaining and started doing, she said. There's a difference. Cole considered that with the particular attention he gave to things that struck him as worth keeping. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way he did when something settled into a place he intended to hold it. The county surveyor's response to Cole's formal request arrived in the second week of October. A letter informing him that a measurement of the disputed boundary would be conducted before the ground froze, with a representative from the county present. It was procedural language in a government envelope, not dramatic by any standard, but Cole read it twice at the kitchen table and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something important. He can't argue with an official measurement, Cole said. He'll find a way to delay it, Evelyn said. She was not being pessimistic. She was being accurate, and Cole knew it. He can delay it. He can't stop it forever. He folded the letter and put it in the box on the shelf where he kept important documents. This is the beginning of the end of that particular fight. How long has it been going on? The fence moving? 2 years of documented incidents. The general pressure? Longer. He stood up from the table. Ruth Ann used to say that Crowley was the kind of man who'd squeeze a stone until it cracked or his hand gave out, and you just had to outlast him. He paused. She was usually right about people. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The mention of Ruth Ann still arrived with a slight shift in the room's atmosphere. Not painful, not awkward, just real. Cole didn't avoid it, and she didn't flinch from it, and the ease with which they had both learned to let her name exist in conversation was, she thought, part of what made the house feel like a place where honest things could be said. She sounds like she had good judgment, Evelyn said. She did. Different from yours. She was quieter about it, but she saw things clearly. He looked at the shelf where the letter sat. She would have liked you. That's not a strange thing to say, is it? No, Evelyn said. I don't think it is. The thing with Silas Peck happened on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. Evelyn was in town for the weekly lesson. She had moved the sessions to the back room of the newly finished church hall, which was larger and better lit than Briggs' storeroom, and had been offered by the building committee once enough people in town had started asking about the children's progress. She was packing up after the children had gone when she heard the door and turned to find Silas Peck standing at the entrance, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had rehearsed something and was now finding that the actual doing of it was harder than the rehearsal. He was a small man, wiry, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the sun-cracked look of someone who had spent decades working outside in all conditions. She had not spoken to him directly since she had been in Red Mesa. She had seen him at the gathering, trailing after Crowley with that hangdog posture, and she had not forgotten what Pablo had told her about the things he had been saying at the saloon. She did not move toward him or away from him. She waited. Miss Mercer, he said. He was turning his hat around in his hands. I was hoping I came to see if you had a minute. I have a few minutes, she said. He came in far enough for the door to close behind him, and then stopped. He looked around the room. The small chairs, the slates on the table, the reader she had left propped against the wall, as if he was buying himself time by taking inventory. I said things, he started, about you, at the saloon and, other places. He stopped. His jaw worked. They weren't true things. I knew they weren't true when I said them. Evelyn looked at him steadily. Crowley, I owe him money, a significant amount. He made it clear that the debt would be handled differently if I did him certain favors. Peck's voice had the flat sound of a man reading from a document he is ashamed of. I told myself it wasn't serious, that it was just talk, that it wouldn't really hurt anyone. He finally looked up at her directly, and his face had the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something long enough that the carrying itself has become the problem. I've seen what it's done. I've watched people treat you like something's wrong with you for 2 months because of things I said, things I made up. The room was quiet. Outside, a wagon was passing on the street, the sound of it moving through the wall and then receding. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. It was a genuine question, not an accusation. Because I watched what happened at the gathering, he said, and I watched Cole Bennett stand there, and I watched you say what you said, and I went home and I couldn't sleep. He looked down at the hat in his hands. And because my daughter has started coming to your lessons. Clara. Evelyn stilled. Clara. The 6-year-old with the terrifying seriousness who had been one of her first students, who approached every word on the page like a problem she personally intended to solve. "She's been coming for 2 months," Evelyn said. "I know, her mother brings her." He paused. "I didn't connect it at first. Clara never said your name at home. She just said her teacher." He swallowed. "Last week she spelled my name for me, at the supper table. She put the letters down with her finger on the tablecloth like you'd taught her." His voice caught slightly on the last sentence. He pressed his mouth together and regained it. "She was so proud of herself." The silence stretched. "I don't know what I'm asking for," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not sure that's something you're obligated to give. I just needed to say it to your face." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. This was not Gerald Whitmore, who had known exactly what he was doing and had done it with relish. This was a man who had been used as a tool and had let himself be used because he was scared of his debts and scared of Crowley, and who had arrived in her classroom to account for it because his daughter had spelled his name on a tablecloth. "I won't pretend it didn't do damage," she said, "because it did, and some of it isn't fully repaired yet." He nodded. He didn't try to minimize it. "But I accept what you've said," she said. "And Clara is a remarkable student. She has been from the first day." Something in Peck's face shifted. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. The look of a man who has been braced for worse and has received something he didn't earn and knows the difference. "Thank you," he said quietly. He put his hat back on and left. Evelyn stood alone in the room for a moment after he'd gone. She thought about what she'd said, "I accept what you've said," and decided it was the right thing and the honest thing, neither more nor less than what the situation asked for. She told Cole about it that evening. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Peck's always been weak," he said. "Not bad. Just weak. Crowley finds those people and uses them." "I know." She paused. "What he told me about the debt, about Crowley making it conditional, is that the kind of thing the county surveyor would want to know?" Cole looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but something sharpening. "It might be relevant to a complaint about boundary manipulation," he said carefully. "Crowley's been using financial pressure to get people to do things that benefit him in a property dispute," she said. "That seems like it might be the kind of thing that belongs in an official record." Cole was quiet for a moment, then, "I'd need Peck to be willing to say it formally, to put his name on it. He came to me today and said it to my face. That took something." She looked at Cole. "He might be willing, if someone asked him the right way." Cole nodded slowly. He was working through it, she could see. Not rushing, just thinking. This was how he solved problems, methodically, thoroughly, without drama. She had watched it enough times now to recognize the process and trust it. "I'll talk to him," Cole said. "Not tomorrow," she said. "Give him a few days. Let what he did today sit with him. He'll be steadier for it." Cole looked at her. "You read people well." "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "Not all of it pleasant." October deepened into itself, and the plains changed character the way they did every year. The light going lower and more golden, the mornings developing a real bite, the grass curing to a dry amber that caught the late sun and held it briefly before the dark came. Evelyn had grown to love the evenings out here in a way she hadn't expected. Back in St. Louis, evenings had been social obligations or hours at the library working late, and solitude had been something she stole in increments. Out here, solitude was built into the landscape itself, and she had learned to inhabit it differently. She and Cole had developed a habit of sitting on the porch after dinner when the weather allowed, not talking much, just existing in the same space with the dark plains spreading out beyond the light of the house. Pablo would sometimes be visible across the yard, moving between the barn and his quarters, and the horses would make occasional sounds. And the sky out here at night was more stars than sky. On one of those evenings, Cole said something that had clearly been waiting a while to be said. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that whatever you answer, it doesn't change anything about what's already here." Evelyn looked at him in the near dark. "All right. When your situation here is stable, when the land dispute is settled and the town has fully settled its opinion of you, I don't want you to feel like you have to stay." He was looking out at the dark, not at her. You came out here because you had no other options. That's honest and it's nothing to be ashamed of. But options have a way of opening back up. And I don't want you building a life here because you're backed into it. She looked at him for a long moment. Cole, I'm serious. I know you're serious. That's what makes it worth answering seriously. She turned back to look at the dark plains. I came here without options, that's true. But I've had 3 months to find out what this place actually is. What you actually are. She paused. I'm not staying because I'm backed into it. I'm staying because when I think about leaving, I think about the things I'd be leaving. The lessons. Pablo's cooking on the nights he takes over the kitchen. The north fence line in the morning when the light comes across the grass. She paused again. You. The word sat between them simply, without decoration. Cole was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to wonder if she had said too much. I'm not an easy man, he said finally. I know that. I'm in my own head too much. I work too much. I'm not good at the softer things. I'm not a soft woman, she said. He turned and looked at her then. In the low light from the doorway, she could see his face clearly enough, the weathered lines of it, the tiredness he carried as a permanent feature, and underneath all of that something careful and real and given very rarely to anyone. No, he said, you're not. They sat in the quiet for a while longer after that. Neither of them moved toward the other. Neither of them needed to, not yet. But something had been named that had been waiting to be named, and the naming of it settled into the evening like a sound that had been part of the air the whole time and had only just become audible. Cole talked to Silas Peck 10 days later. She didn't ask him how it went immediately. She let him come to her when he was ready, which was that same evening after dinner. He sat down at the table and told her straight. He'll talk to the surveyor, Cole said. He'll put his name on a formal statement about the debt and the conditions Crowley attached to it. Was he scared? Yes. But he said he was going to do it anyway. Cole looked at the table. He said, he paused. He said his daughter deserved a teacher who wasn't there because her father was a coward. Evelyn said nothing. She picked up her cup of coffee and held it in both hands and looked at the lamp flame. Crowley's going to find out, she said. Eventually, but by then the surveyor's record will already exist and there'll be nothing to do about it. What will Crowley do when he finds out? Come at me directly, probably. On the land dispute, which is where it should have been all along. Cole looked up at her. That's a fight I know how to have. She believed him. She had watched him work for 3 months, and she knew how he operated when there was a clear problem with a clear solution. Quietly, persistently, without wasted motion. Crowley had been fighting at angles because he had preferred leverage to direct contest. Take the leverage away, and the fight changed shape. In the 3rd week of October, the county surveyor arrived with 2 assistants and spent 2 days measuring the boundary line on the north fence. Cole was present for all of it. Evelyn drove out to the north pasture on the 2nd afternoon and watched from a distance. Not because she needed to be there, but because it was her home, and she wanted to see it. The measurement confirmed what Cole had maintained for 2 years. The fence had been moved. The documentation went into the county record. A formal notice was delivered to Wade Crowley at the Double C, informing him that the boundary encroachment had been measured and recorded. Peck's statement was filed separately, attached as supporting evidence of coordinated interference in a property dispute. Crowley's response, when it came, was not what Evelyn had expected. She had anticipated anger, more pressure, another campaign, some new lever. What came instead was silence. 3 days of it, and then a letter delivered to Cole through the county office, formal and dry in its language, acknowledging the surveyor's findings and requesting a meeting to discuss the resolution of the boundary dispute. Cole read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it to her without comment. She read it. He's retreating, she said. He's recalculating, Cole said. There's a difference. He's not done, but he knows he overreached, and now there's a paper trail, and Peck's name is on a document, and he's got to figure out his next position. Will you meet with him? I'll meet with him, with the county record in hand and my own lawyer present. He paused. He'll want to settle the boundary formally and quietly. That's my guess. And you'll let him? Cole looked at her. I want the land dispute settled. That's what this was always about for me. I'm not interested in destroying the man. I'm interested in protecting what's mine. He paused. What's ours? The word landed quietly between them. Ours. Not a declaration, not a speech, just the plain word used plainly, the way he used most words, and the weight of it was exactly proportional to what had been built over the past months. The fence lines ridden together, the storms weathered, the mornings starting in the same kitchen, the evenings on the same porch, the accumulated ordinary reality of two people who had started as strangers and had become, without making a ceremony of it, something else entirely. She handed the letter back to him. "Then let's settle it," she said. Outside, the wind came across the plains with the first real edge of winter in it. The grass had gone the color of old straw, and the sky had that high, clear, cold quality that meant the warm days were numbered. The ranch sat in the middle of all of it, unlovely and solid and real, with its mismatched porch post and its fading east wall paint and its kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and had for years before she arrived and would for years after. She was not a woman who had arrived here gracefully. She had come in tears, with a ruined name and a single small trunk and the last of her pride barely intact. She had fallen off a horse and burned a pan of cornbread and misjudged the timing of the first frost and had to spend an afternoon replanting the kitchen garden seedlings she'd brought in too late. She had also taught 14 children to read, helped hold a ranch together through a difficult summer, stood up in a crowded fairground and said the true thing out loud, and slowly, imperfectly, without anyone granting it to her, made herself a place in this community. It wasn't finished. Nothing was finished yet. But for the first time since she had packed that small trunk in St. Louis and made her way to the stagecoach, she was not running towards something in desperation. She was standing still on ground she had earned. And that was something entirely different. The meeting between Cole and Wade Crowley happened on a Thursday morning in early November, in the county office in Red Mesa, with a lawyer present on each side, and Sheriff Macon sitting in the corner saying nothing and existing mainly as a reminder that the proceedings were official. Evelyn did not attend. It was not her meeting to attend, and she had not asked to be there. She spent the morning at the church hall with her students and tried not to think about what was happening 12 minutes walk away. She mostly succeeded. Clara Peck was working through a passage about a river that ran through a valley, her small finger moving under each word with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Danny Marsh, who had long since stopped pretending he was just there to walk his brother home and now sat at the table with the others as a full participant, was writing out his first complete sentence on a slate, a thing he had told her 3 weeks ago he didn't think he'd ever be able to do. She had told him the only thing that separated him from doing it was time and practice, and he had looked at her with the frank skepticism of a 14-year-old who has been disappointed by easy reassurances before, and she had said, "I'm not telling you it'll be easy. I'm telling you it's possible." He'd believed that version. The sentence on his slate read, "My name is Daniel James Marsh, and I live in Red Mesa, Wyoming." She looked at it for a moment and felt something in her chest that had no clean name, not quite pride because it wasn't her accomplishment, and not quite joy because it was too grounded in reality for that word. Something closer to the feeling of watching a difficult thing become possible. The feeling that the world contains more of that than you sometimes think it does when things are going badly. "Read it out loud," she told him. He read it out loud. His voice was flat and self-conscious, and he got through every word without stopping. "Again," she said. He read it again. This time it sounded like something he owned. Cole came to find her at the church hall just before noon. He appeared in the doorway, saw the lesson was still in progress, and waited outside. She wrapped things up a few minutes early and sent the children home and went out to where he was standing on the front step looking at the street. She looked at his face and read it before he said anything. Not victory. Cole was not a man who wore victory. But something settled. The particular expression of a man who has been fighting a slow, grinding fight for a long time and has just watched it reach an end. "It's done," he said. "The boundary? Formally recorded." Crowley's acknowledged the encroachment in writing and agreed to the corrected line. His lawyer tried to negotiate 2 minor points, and we gave him one of them, which was enough for Crowley to tell himself he didn't lose completely. He looked at the street. "The creek access on the north pasture is confirmed as ours. It'll be in the county record permanently." Evelyn let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. "And Peck's statement? Stays in the file. Crowley knows it's there. That's part of what made him settle instead of fight." Cole glanced at her. He's not a man who likes things on the record that he can't control. What happens to him now? Cole considered the question honestly, without satisfaction and without false sympathy. He still has his ranch. He still has his money. He's lost some standing in the county because enough people know what he tried to do, and he knows they know, and that'll sit with him. He paused. Men like him don't usually change. They recalculate. He'll find somewhere else to push, someone else with less ability to push back. That's just what he is. She had thought about this, about whether there was something incomplete in an ending that didn't fundamentally alter Wade Crowley, that left him intact and operational and merely inconvenienced. She had decided there wasn't, because the world didn't owe her a transformed antagonist. It owed her a fair outcome on the things that could be fairly settled. The creek line was settled. The record existed. Crowley had been checked, not by force or luck, but by documentation and persistence, and the willingness of people like Silas Peck to eventually tell the truth. That was enough. It had to be enough, and honestly, it was. Good, she said. Cole looked at her. You all right? I was going to ask you the same thing. He thought about it genuinely, which was his way. He didn't answer questions reflexively. He actually considered them. I'm tired, he said. 2 years of that is a long time, but I'm all right. He looked back at the street. I'm better than all right, if I'm being honest. She understood what he meant without needing him to elaborate. November settled over the plains with the particular authority of a Wyoming winter beginning to mean business. The first real snow came in the second week, not the light dusting that had come and gone twice already, but several inches of actual accumulation that changed the look of everything, turned the brown grass white, made the ranch feel both more isolated and more itself. Evelyn had grown up with snow, but not this kind of snow, not this expanse of it in every direction with nothing to interrupt it for miles. She stood on the porch the morning after that first real storm and looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt glad. Not relieved, not resigned, genuinely glad to be standing on that particular porch, looking at that particular landscape, with the smell of coffee coming through the door behind her, and the sound of Pablo breaking ice on the water trough in the yard, and the knowledge that there was work waiting that she knew how to do. She had not felt glad in a place for a very long time. Cole came out and stood beside her with his own coffee. They looked at the snow together. It'll be a hard winter, he said. You say that every year, she guessed. Every year I've been here. Sometimes I'm right. And when you're wrong? Then it's a mild winter and I wasted a lot of worry. He drank his coffee. Either way, the cows need feeding. She laughed. It was a real laugh. Not performed, not the polite social version she had deployed for years in St. Louis drawing rooms, but the actual laugh of someone who finds something genuinely funny because they are genuinely present in the moment that produced it. It surprised her slightly, the realness of it. Cole looked at her sideways. Something in his face was open in a way it usually wasn't in the mornings before the day had worked on him. That's the first time I've heard you laugh like that, he said. Like what? Like you meant it. She looked at him. I've been laughing for months. You've been smiling, being polite. This was different. He wasn't pressing it, just noting it, stating a fact the way he stated facts. She thought about that. He was right, and she knew he was right, and the fact that he had noticed the difference told her something about how carefully he had been watching her, not with suspicion or analysis, just with the kind of attention that people give to things they care about. I'm happy, she said. The word came out slightly blunt and unembellished, the way true things sometimes do when you stop dressing them up. I'm actually happy. I don't know the last time that was straightforwardly true. Cole looked back at the snow. Good, he said. It was the same word she'd used when he'd told her the land dispute was settled, and it carried the same weight. Not small, not simple, just exact. It was Pablo who made the formal observation first, which surprised her, and then, on reflection, didn't. She was in the barn in the third week of November, helping him with a routine check on the horses, and they were working in the companionable near silence they had developed over months of shared work, when he said without preamble and without looking up from what he was doing, "He's better with you here." She looked at him. He was examining a foreleg with the focused attention he gave everything practical. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she had a sense. After Ruth Ann died, he worked. Pablo moved to the next horse. That's all he did. Morning to dark, 7 days. I don't know what I thought. That's just how he was going to be. He was quiet for a moment. He talked less than he does now. And he wasn't mean about it. That's not what I mean. He was just away somewhere, even when he was standing right in front of you. She was quiet, listening. He's not away anymore, Pablo said. He finished his examination and straightened up and looked at her with the direct simplicity of a man who had said the thing he came to say. That's all. He went back to work. She stood there for a moment holding a brush she had stopped using and thought about Cole Bennett at that kitchen table 3 years ago after Ruth Ann's fever, starting a morning that had no particular reason to be started. Doing it anyway. Working the ranch through the grief of it alone, except for Pablo, who had his own way of staying and his own way of helping that didn't announce itself. She thought about the advertisement Cole had placed in a newspaper, carefully worded, honest, a little formal. The advertisement of a man who had decided that being alone was not the same thing as being in the right condition and that he had enough left in him to try again. She thought about herself reading it in a room in St. Louis after everything had fallen apart, thinking, this is the most desperate thing I have ever considered doing. Both of them had been right about what they needed. Both of them had been scared of what finding it might cost. They had arrived at each other through the least romantic possible mechanism. A newspaper listing, a few letters, a stagecoach, and they had built something real, and the building of it had been awkward and slow and imperfect in every way that things built by imperfect people are imperfect. She would not have changed a single ungainly piece of it. December arrived and the ranch contracted into the smaller, closer life of a hard winter. The cattle were in the lower pasture, the water trough was broken and fixed and broken again. The north wind found every gap in the walls of the house, and Evelyn spent 2 days tracking them down and blocking them with rags soaked in linseed oil, a technique Pablo had shown her. And Cole had come home to find her on a ladder patching the top corner of the east wall, and had stood below the ladder with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing useful, and being there in case she fell. She didn't fall. The reading lessons moved to a twice-weekly schedule in December because the weather made daily travel impractical, but attendance didn't drop. Parents drove their children in through cold that had no particular interest in their convenience because the children wanted to come. Danny Marsh, who had started the winter unable to read a single word, was by December working his way through a primer that was intended for 8-year-olds and finding it not nearly difficult enough. She ordered more advanced material through Harlan Briggs, who by now processed her orders with the brisk efficiency of a man who had long since decided she was simply part of the fabric of town commerce. Dorothea Crane came to the lesson one December afternoon and stayed after, as she sometimes did. The building committee has been talking, Dorothea said, with the directness that was her permanent mode of communication. About what? About a proper school. A real one. With a dedicated building. Dorothea looked at her steadily. They want to know if you'd be willing to run it. Evelyn looked at her. I have a ranch. You have a ranch? And a husband who's capable of managing it. Dorothea said husband with the matter-of-fact assurance of someone describing an established fact, which technically it still wasn't. There had been no ceremony, no formal arrangement beyond what they had agreed to in letters before she arrived, and which simultaneously made both of them perfectly aware of what the situation had actually become, regardless of paperwork. The school wouldn't need you full-time, mornings, 5 days a week. It would serve the whole county. Evelyn thought about it. The teaching certificates that had sat at the bottom of her trunk since St. Louis. The 14 children who were learning to read in the back room of a church hall. Danny Marsh and his slate. Clara Peck and her terrifying seriousness. The primer that wasn't difficult enough anymore. I'd need to talk to Cole, she said. Of course, Dorothea said, but I'd like an answer before spring. She talked to Cole that evening. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was his standard operating mode, and then he sat with it for a moment in the way that meant he was actually thinking and not just pausing to be polite. It's what you trained for, he said. It's also a significant commitment. To the town, and it would take time away from the ranch. Cole looked at her. The ranch has Pablo, and me. We managed before you got here. He paused. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that to push you toward it. I'm saying it because I don't want you making this decision based on what you think I need. He held her gaze. What do you want? The question sat between them simply. He asked it the same way he had asked, months ago on that first long drive, what she was afraid of, straight and unhurried, as though the answer mattered and was worth waiting for. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical, not what was safe, not what would cause the least disruption, what she actually wanted. "I want the school," she said. "Then we'll figure out the ranch around it." It was that simple. Not easy. Nothing about building a life from scratch was easy, but simple. Two people making a decision together and then working backward from it to figure out the practical shape. That was a thing she had not understood was possible until she had lived it for 5 months in the company of a man who treated her judgment as a thing worth consulting. She had spent years in St. Louis around men who smiled and opened doors and made speeches about the importance of women of character, and who could not tolerate a woman who actually exercised the character they claimed to admire. Cole Bennett had never made a single speech about it. He had simply, from the first day, treated her opinions as relevant and her decisions as hers to make. It was the most radical thing anyone had ever done for her, and it had been done so quietly she had almost not noticed. The formal conversation happened on a Saturday night in late December, in the kitchen with snow pressing against the windows and the lamp burning between them on the table, and both of them knowing that what they were talking about was not actually a new thing but the naming of something that had been true for a while. "We should talk about what this is," Cole said. He said it without preamble, the way he said everything. "What do you think it is?" she asked. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "I think it's a life we've been building. I think it's something I wasn't sure I'd have again after Ruth Ann. And I think—" He stopped. He pressed his mouth together for a moment. "I'm not good at this part." "You're doing all right," she said. "I think you're the most honest person I've met in a long time," he said. "And I think the ranch is better, and I'm better. And I want this to be formal, real. I want us to be married in whatever way you want, whenever you're ready, if that's what you want." He said it plainly, without ornament, without getting down on a knee or constructing a romantic occasion out of it. It was simply Cole Bennett saying the true thing in the most direct available language, which was the only language he reliably spoke. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, the lines in his face, the gray at his temples, the particular stillness of a man who has asked the most important question he knows how to ask, and is now just waiting honestly for the answer. "It's what I want," she said. He nodded once. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not dramatically, not like a scene from a novel. Just his hand over hers, warm and steady, a fact. They sat like that for a while with the snow outside and the lamp between them, and no particular need to fill the silence with anything more. They were married in February, on a morning that was bitterly cold but clear, in the finished church hall with a small gathering of people who had, each in their own way and at their own pace, decided that Evelyn Mercer was worth knowing. Dorothea and George Crane were there. Harlan Briggs and his wife Martha, who had come a long way from the woman who avoided the front of her own store. The Aldred family. The Marsh boys, both of them. Danny standing straight in a shirt that was slightly too big and managing to look, for a few minutes, like the man he was going to become. Silas Peck and his wife and Clara, who wore a blue dress and sat through the whole ceremony with her hands folded in her lap and her full serious attention fixed on the proceedings as though she intended to remember every detail. Pablo stood beside Cole. He had put on his good jacket, which Evelyn had seen only once before, and he stood there with his characteristic stillness and the look of a man attending something that mattered. There was no large crowd, there was no performance. The ceremony was short and unadorned and genuine, the way things are when the people doing them are not trying to convince anyone of anything because the thing being done is simply true. Wade Crowley was not there. He had not been seen at any Red Mesa gathering since November, and the word from the county was that he had spent the winter deep in his own operations, recalculating, which was what Cole had predicted. Whether he would resurface as a problem was something neither of them spent much energy worrying about. The record existed. The boundary was set. And Evelyn had come to understand that you could not spend your life managing enemies who hadn't made their next move yet. You had to live in the meantime. She had a lot of meantime to live. The school opened in March, in a dedicated room of the church hall while a proper building was being planned. On the first day, 17 children showed up. By the second week, there were 22. By April, parents from ranches 15 miles out were driving their children in twice a week because the word had traveled that there was a teacher in Red Mesa who actually taught. She was not a perfect teacher. She lost her patience with Robbie Marsh once in early April when he disrupted the lesson for the third time in an afternoon, and she said something sharper than she intended and had to apologize to him in front of the class, which was the right thing to do and was uncomfortable in exactly the way the right thing often is. She misjudged the pace of one student and had to backtrack 2 weeks of material. She had a disagreement with one of the building committee members about the curriculum that lasted 3 weeks and was never quite fully resolved, just negotiated to a workable middle. None of it was what she would have chosen if she were designing her life from the outside. All of it was hers. There is a particular quality to a life that belongs to you, a roughness to it, a weight, an occasional resistance that is different from the smooth surface of a life you're performing for other people or surviving through or waiting for something better to replace. Evelyn had spent too long in the second kind and had almost forgotten what the first kind felt like. She remembered now. On a Sunday in April, she rode out to the north fence line alone. She did this sometimes when she needed to think, or when she didn't need to think and just wanted the space of the plains and the particular silence of being somewhere that asked nothing of her. The creek was running well again, snowmelt from the mountains filling it back to a width that made the summer drought seem briefly impossible. The fence line was solid and correctly placed and had a stake at the corner with the county marker on it, a modest piece of iron that represented 2 years of Cole's persistence and Silas Peck's courage and the simple, dogged fact that the truth, properly documented and refused to be abandoned, eventually holds. She sat on her horse at the north boundary and looked out at the land. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 9 months ago, shaking and exhausted and crying in front of strangers on a dusty street. She did not think of her with contempt or even with the distant sympathy you feel for a past self who didn't know better. She thought of her with something more like respect, because that woman had been breaking apart and had gotten back up anyway, had answered the advertisement, had gotten on the stagecoach, had arrived. The rest of it, the ranch, the school, Cole, Pablo, the cranes and the marshes, and Clara Peck spelling her father's name at a supper table. None of it would exist if that woman had not made the desperate, unglamorous, absolutely necessary decision to try one more time. People talk about belonging as though it is something a place or a community gives you. You belong here. You fit in. You're one of us. As though it is a judgment rendered from outside that you either receive or don't. Evelyn had spent most of her life waiting for that judgment, adjusting herself to try to earn it, and watching it be withdrawn by people who had their own uses for her exclusion. What she understood now, what 9 months of living on these plains in this imperfect house with these imperfect people had taught her, was that belonging is not a verdict. It is a practice. It is the daily work of showing up and being honest and doing what you said you'd do and getting back on the horse and teaching the lesson and saying the true thing in the crowded room even when your hands are shaking. It is built. Slowly, unglamorously, out of materials that don't look like much on their own. She had built it, with her own hands and her own choices and a stubbornness she had once been ashamed of and had finally decided was simply a part of her, as fixed as the color of her eyes. The creek moved in the morning light and the plains stretched south, and the sky above Wyoming was enormous and indifferent in the way it always was. And Evelyn Bennett, she had taken the name in February without ceremony and without particular sentiment, just as a fact of what her life had become, sat on her horse at the north fence line and looked at all of it. She thought, this is mine, not in the grasping sense, not in the sense of possession, in the sense of truth. This is mine, in the way that a life honestly lived is yours. Not because you deserve it more than someone else, not because you won it, but because you were present for it. You stayed, you did the work, you let it be hard, and you kept going anyway. That is the whole of it, really. That is the whole secret of it. She turned her horse and rode back toward home.